Delusions, birds, and a direwolf. Yo, what's going on? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report is coming from Lily, which was sent in. This happened around August 2018. The drugs used, and we have 3 people here. Lily, she took 200 UGs of LSD. Her friend Jay took 100 UGs and 10 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT, and her friend Green took 100 micrograms, and the route of administration was sublingual and oral. Gender, female. Weight, 250 pounds. Age, 20. Height, 5'6". Prior experience, LSD, 4-ACO DMT, alcohol, cannabis, and kava, and the setting is at Green's house at the middle of the night. So this is a classic LSD experience that I think includes quite a bit of almost everything. A lot of aspects that you'll find on a trip, from anxiety to self-realizations to observations of the external world and whatnot, and so on. And so, as always, I think you guys are going to enjoy it. And without further ado, let's dive right into it. Originally, our plan was to watch a meteor shower. I'd done 200 micrograms of LSD. My friend Jay, who is also relatively experienced, did 100 micrograms of LSD and 20 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT, synthetic magic mushrooms. Finally, there was my friend, who I'll call Green. It was her first time doing any psychedelic substance. I gave her 100 micrograms of LSD. We were at Green's house. Green and Jay had not met before, but both were good friends with me. In addition, I had a very strong confidence that they'd mesh well together. It's one of those things that seems meant to be. Green is pretty eccentric, to say the least, and this totally set the mood differently. She breeds birds and identifies as a witch. I'm not superstitious, but she's so pure of heart that I can't bring myself to laugh at her or judge her. Green has a massive German shepherd named Corvo. Corvo looks a lot like dog meat from the Fallout games, but much bigger. A tall, skinny, imposing, muscular German shepherd. He's being trained as a service dog. He can be very rough and clumsy when he plays, but he never tries to hurt anyone. It started off with Jay and I having parked at Green's place. Jay lives in the opposite direction of Green, so they drove to my house, and I drove them the rest of the way so we could both save gas. We could hear the neighbors a bit, and Green had some fantasy-style Celtic music going. Green and Jay, before anything kicked in, were already hitting off. Green had set up a bunch of blankets and a speaker outside. I was watching the meteor shower, and there were tons of shooting stars. Green and Jay were talking, me not paying much attention to them. Jay's kicked in first, much sooner than Green or myself, since 4-ACO DMT is a very fast-acting substance. They talked about how the tree above part of the deck was twisting and warping as it blew in the wind. As mentioned before, Green breeds birds. She brought out 2 little ones for Jay and I to hold, both of them siblings and too young to fly. For some reason, the shooting stars had stopped. Since Jay and Green didn't really care about the stars, I mentioned to Green that the visuals, which were beginning for me, would be much more obvious in light. So Green turned on her porch light and I could see my bird better. I think she was some kind of baby parrot. She was green and her feathers looked like hairs with smaller hairs on them. The visuals for me were just starting to creep in, and I could see every tiny detail. Her colors would shift between green and a pale blue, and holding her in my hands against my chest, I could feel her heartbeat in my hands. And considering a bird's heartbeat is much faster than a human's, it felt like she was vibrating and pulsing in my hand. I was also experiencing what I can only describe as tactile tracers. The bird's feet would be in one spot of my hand, and she'd move. Then I'd be able to feel both the new spot she was sitting/standing in, and the spot she'd been on previously for several seconds. Green, meanwhile, had her main parrot, one which she doesn't plan to sell, and is more of a pet, though she adores all of them. She was a really huge bird, seemingly quite odd. She hates me and everyone who isn't green, but she was just sitting on her shoulder. She'd occasionally fly around the deck, but never leave the general area. Eventually Green suggested we go inside. Since they weren't watching the stars, I came with them. Her parrot went back to her perch inside and went to sleep, but the birds Jay and I had been holding were sleeping in a little Tupperware container next to us. Green had set up a cozy area in the corner of the living room. We'd brought the speaker in, and Green had put up a bunch of blankets and stuffed animals. The speaker was glowing green, and she'd lit a diffuser with lemongrass oil in it, which was sitting in the middle of us, also glowing green. The smells, combined with all the nature-themed decor in her living room, gave it this very heavy fantasy vibe. Green had started mashing up some of her birds' hatched eggshells in a mortar and pestle, doing witch stuff. Again, I don't get it, but she's a good person. It was hot, so she took off her top. Her dog, Corvo, looked even more exaggerated. He was walking around the green light, occasionally sitting down by us. His fur looked very fine, and he seemed larger than life, even feral, like a direwolf. And Green looked like some sort of fantasy druid with her bowls and birds around her. Eventually, things started to get pretty weird though. Corvo had left, and Jay was getting frustrated that they couldn't find their drugs. I was getting kind of annoyed at this, because I was just trying to enjoy the music with Green while she told me about her religion and her birds. I think Green heard the neighbors from the next yard over, because she started getting really jumpy and weird. She thought there were cops outside looking for us, and was being really paranoid. I told her that the cops had no reason to know what we were doing, and nobody would call the cops because we weren't causing any trouble. I was pretty concerned about her. She was really out there, and 100 micrograms, which is a small dose for most people, seemed to be affecting her very heavily. Green agreed with me, but didn't seem convinced. She said she was going to lay down with her boyfriend, who was asleep. The bedroom door was open, so I could see/hear what was going on, and she just laid in bed with him, not talking. But about 20 minutes later, she came out sobbing. She said her boyfriend was mad at her because Corvo had eaten Jay's sheet of acid and thrown up in the yard. At first, I was freaked out. I imagined a giant dog running around in the dark and terrorizing people outside, like some sort of escaped science experiment. Between that and the police thing, Green was really freaking out and crying and locking all of the doors. I had the idea to see if Corvo was still in the house. I wasn't familiar with LSD causing delusional stuff, but I figured something wasn't right, because all of the doors had been closed, and LSD is odorless. And from where we ordered ours, it was in a tiny black bag. There'd be no reason for a dog to want to eat it. I called for Corvo, and he ran in and was jumping all over me and playfully biting my hand, completely unaware at how batshit crazy his mom was acting. I'm glad I didn't interpret this as a different way, or it would have been terrifying to have a giant, possibly insane dog barreling towards me. I told Green that if Corvo had eaten the drugs, he'd be acting really weird. I also realized how to explain what was going on. I'd said she was having a bad trip and negative thought loops, and that she would be okay. I said we were both there for her, and that we'd both done this before. I told her that this happens to other people on occasion, and that paranoia and fear of persecution is something that happens on bad trips. She actually started laughing because she was so relieved. I think realizing that these fears were being caused by the drug helped her a huge amount. Jay had stopped complaining about losing their drugs because I pretty much told them to shut up and that they were scaring Green, but something still seemed to be bothering them. I was holding one of the baby birds again and was really nice. I felt like a mother, protecting it. I had it cuddled up in the cups of my hands against my chest. He climbed up and was sort of standing on my finger. All of a sudden, I felt something cold and wet on my dress, my favorite one too. Because I was, at this point, at the highest point in the peak and the deepest I've ever gone on a trip, I didn't make the connection that the bird caused it. I thought it was a tactile hallucination, like the tracers I'd felt on my hands earlier. I had exclaimed, quite excitedly, "That was the trippiest shit." Green, confused, just asked, "What was?" And I started explaining the weird, wet hallucination. And as I started describing it, I sort of stopped as I realized what the bird had done, and Green and Jay were both staring at me, Jay kind of giggling. Green was super embarrassed, and I kind of started freaking out, because in my head, it was a way bigger mess than it was in reality. I quickly handed the bird to Green, and I just threw my dress off in a panic, now standing in front of them in just my underwear. I went to get a t-shirt I remembered I had in my backpack, but I saw my reflection in the mirror with me being only in my bra and bottoms, and saw Green, who's very beautiful, and I started crying. I talked about the bar analogy, the question that, if you met yourself in a bar, would you date yourself? And I was sobbing and said no, I absolutely wouldn't, because I hate how I look. Jay had also finally brought up what was bothering them. They were upset about a friend who wasn't talking to them, and Green was upset because we were all just wage slaves who build more things for our corporate overlords. Why do we always realize this on LSD? So we took turns talking about each issue and crying around the green light. Once the more emotional stuff was over, the conversations turned more casual. They'd both fully come down, but I was still at the tail end of my peak due to having taken a higher dose. It was about 4 a.m, and Jay was exhausted and really wanted to go home and would not negotiate on this matter. There was a miscommunication, and Jay was under the impression that we wouldn't be there all night. ? Jay had originally driven to my place, and then I'd driven them the rest of the way so we could save on gas. But I wasn't good to drive, so I had Jay drive us to my place in my car. This was super weird / fun / scary. I drive an old Buick Regal, pretty junky, but it does what it needs to do. The dashboard is wavy, so in the darkness, with the buttons lit up and weirdly shaped dashboard, and Jay's phone as the GPS on the magnetic holder I have, we were driving down the freeway at about 70 miles per hour, and lights and buildings were whizzing by, until we were driving through a forest at about 55 miles per hour. And this sounds insignificant, but it honestly felt like I was in a spaceship. I could feel us moving way more. The road was warping, and it kept looking like Jay was swerving off the road when we weren't. I already wasn't confident in Jay's driving abilities because of past observations, but I basically just told myself that Jay was my best friend, and I really just had to put my faith in them. I just tried to focus on our conversations, and eventually learned to just enjoy the exhilarating experience. When we got home, the sun was just starting to rise. I got in bed thinking I'd pass out, and I didn't. I thought it was just the LSD, and it needed time to wear off. I watched Bob's Burgers for a bit. I just did a bunch of stuff to try and relax, and couldn't go to sleep. Throughout the next day, I kept trying to make myself fall asleep, and couldn't. It didn't help that my dad was working on the roof and hammering outside my window. That night, I couldn't relax either. I was still having closed-eye visuals in the dark, though this was probably in part due to sleep deprivation and hypnagogia. It was starting to really freak me out because I was worried I'd done something to mess up my brain. And finally, with the help of 2 Benadryl, I almost never use it because I know there are a lot of health risks, but I was desperate and had work the next day, and headphones and intense focus. I finally fell asleep, concluding the experience. It was pretty weird overall. I'm not sure what I learned from it. I guess I learned that I could handle difficulties and stress better than I thought. But if there's anything other people can take away from this, it's that you should always make safety plans ahead of time. Have someone in case things go south. Know where you put your stuff ahead of time. And if you're holding birds, probably bring a towel or extra set of clothes.